The late afternoon sun, filtered through the rustling leaves of a mature pin oak, cast a dappled light across the Eleanor Pendleton Memorial Garden. Arthur Pendleton knelt on a foam pad, his fingers stained with the rich, dark soil of Summit Ridge, gently tamping the earth around the base of a newly planted Lenten rose. It was a hellebore, Eleanor's favorite, its shy, nodding flowers a quiet testament to a love that had outlasted even life itself. Each stone in the low, curving retaining wall, each perennial carefully chosen for its bloom time, was a paragraph in a story only he could still read. He felt a familiar, cold clarity settle over him, the same focus he'd had when inspecting the structural integrity of a bridge. A sense that every component had its purpose, every angle its reason. A shadow fell over him. "Quite the project you have going here, Mr. Pendleton." The voice was smooth, carrying a synthetic sweetness that never quite reached the eyes. Arthur didn't need to look up to know it was Carol Vance, president of the estates at Summit Ridge Homeowners Association. He slowly finished his work on the hellebore, pressing the soil one last time before placing his trowel on the grass beside him. He rose, his knees protesting with a faint creak, and turned. Ms. Vance stood on the pristine sidewalk that bordered his lawn, a posture of perfect, unyielding rectitude. Her linen pantsuit was a crisp, unforgiving white, her sunglasses so large and dark they reflected the world back in a distorted panorama. Beside her, a step behind and to the left, was Kyle, a young man from Prestige Community Management. He clutched a clipboard to his chest like a shield, his gaze darting nervously between Miss Vance, Arthur's garden, and the manicured perfection of the common area lawn across the street. A few neighbors, pretending to retrieve their mail or inspect their own suspiciously flawless flower beds, had paused their activities. The air in the cul-de-sac grew still, attentive. "Ms. Vance," Arthur said, his tone even and polite. He wiped his hands on a rag tucked into the pocket of his worn overalls. "Kyle, a beautiful day for an inspection." "We prefer to call them community reviews," Ms. Vance corrected, a thin smile playing on her lips. "It's more collaborative. We're all partners in maintaining the aesthetic harmony of the estates." She gestured with a perfectly manicured hand towards the garden. "This installation, it's certainly ambitious. The ACC doesn't seem to have a record of an application for it." The words were chosen with surgical precision, each one a small, polite incision. Installation, not a garden. Ambitious, not beautiful. She wasn't making an accusation. She was making a public statement of non-compliance, a social humiliation for the benefit of the watching eyes. Arthur met her gaze, his own eyes, clear and blue, unwavering. "It's a memorial for my wife, Carol. Just a few flowers and a small retaining wall to manage the grade. It's entirely on my property." "That's the question, isn't it?" Ms. Vance's voice dropped, becoming more conspiratorial, as if letting him in on a secret he was too foolish to understand. "The community's governing documents are very specific about alterations on lots that are adjacent to, or which impact the visual character of, common areas. That wall." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "It creates a rather stark visual interruption to the natural flow of the view corridor from the walking path." Kyle, on cue, made a note on his clipboard. The scratch of his pen was the only sound. Arthur's composure remained absolute. He knew this was a performance, and he would not be an unwilling actor in her play. "I have my property survey from when we built the house. The pin is 20 feet past that wall, I assure you. It's well within my lot lines." "Surveys can be misinterpreted," Ms. Vance said, dismissing a notarized legal document with a wave of her hand. "The board's interpretation, guided by our management professionals, is what ensures consistency. We can't have everyone just building things based on their own ideas. That's how harmony decays into chaos. She turned to leave. Her authority asserted. The public warning delivered. You'll be hearing from Prestige Management. Arthur, I do hope we can resolve this amicably. It was not a wish. It was a threat, wrapped in the sterile language of corporate procedure. Arthur watched them walk away, the crisp white of Ms. Vance's pantsuit, a glaring slash against the verdant green of the neighborhood. He looked back at the garden, at Eleanor's Lenten roses, the quiet peace he had carefully cultivated here, in this small patch of earth, had been breached. This wasn't about a wall or a view. He didn't know what it was about yet, but he knew, with the certainty of a structural engineer spotting a hairline fracture in a support beam, that this was only the beginning. Arthur Pendleton was a man of quiet routines and precise habits. His retirement, after 40 years as a civil engineer, was not a descent into aimless leisure, but a transition to a different kind of project life, a life he was supposed to have shared with Eleanor. Her diagnosis had come just 6 months after his retirement party. The 2 years that followed were a blur of hospitals, treatments, and a desperate, clinging hope that ended, as it so often does, in a quiet room filled with the soft beeping of machines. In the year since she'd been gone, Arthur had poured his methodical nature into 2 things: preserving her memory and understanding the complex systems that governed his new, solitary existence. The first was the garden. The second was the thick, 3-ring binder that sat on his desk, its spine embossed in gold foil. The estates at Summit Ridge covenants, conditions and restrictions. His daughter, Sarah, a sharp corporate lawyer with a pragmatist's view of the world, thought his obsession with the binder was morbid. Dad, nobody actually reads that thing, she'd said over their weekly video call. Just don't paint your house purple and make sure your lawn is mowed. That's all you need to know. The language is always in the details. Honey, he'd replied, holding up a page covered in his neat, architectural handwriting. It's a contract. You should always know the terms of the contracts you live under. Now, that contract was being weaponized against him. The community Ms. Vance ruled was one of silent, simmering compliance. Whispers traveled through the neighborhood about her selective enforcement, the fines levied against the Miller family for their son's basketball hoop being left out overnight, while the former board treasurer's unapproved deck extension was conveniently ignored. People paid the fines. They took down the basketball hoops. They lived under a low-grade fear, a desire to not be the next one singled out by the woman in the white pantsuit. The aesthetic harmony she spoke of was the harmony of a population that knew to keep its head down. Arthur's project, however, was different. The garden was not a whim. It was a sanctuary, a living monument. When he was digging in the soil, his hands covered in the same earth that now held his wife, he felt close to her. To surrender the garden would be to surrender a piece of her, and that was a term he would not accept. He opened the binder to the architectural controls section. His highlighter had already marked the relevant clause. For 8.4.2, he read it for the 10th time. No structure, including but not limited to fences, walls, or significant landscaping features, shall be erected or maintained upon any lot adjacent to a common area, without the prior written approval of the Architectural Control Committee ACC. It seemed straightforward, but the words, he knew, were levers, adjacent to, significant, approval. Each could be interpreted, twisted, and used. He had assumed, as any reasonable person would, that a low, 18-inch wall a full 20 feet inside his own property line was not the intended target of such a rule. He was beginning to understand that reason had very little to do with this. His phone rang. It was Sarah. "Hey, Dad. Just checking in. How was your day?" He could hear the forced brightness in her voice. She worried about him, about the quietness of the big house. "It was productive," he said, looking at the binder. "I had a visit from the welcome wagon, Ms. Vance and her associate from the management company." A pause on the other end. "Oh no. Dad, what happened? Please tell me you were polite." "I am always polite. Sarah. She seems to believe Eleanor's garden is a threat to the neighborhood's visual character." He heard her sigh, a long, weary exhalation that spoke of billable hours and risk mitigation. "The garden. What's wrong with it?" She mentioned a view corridor and an unapproved wall. "Okay," Sarah said, her lawyer brain activating. "Okay, so this is what you do. You write a nice, apologetic letter. You fill out the ACC application retroactively. You say you misunderstood the rule. You bake her some cookies. You make it go away. It's not worth the fight. Dad, these people are crazy. They have nothing better to do than torment homeowners. And they confine you into oblivion." "It's on my property, Sarah. It's not a matter of opinion." "It is. Though that's the whole point. The CC&Rs give the board the power to make their opinion the only one that matters. Don't poke the bear. You're retired. This is supposed to be your time to relax." He looked out the window at the garden, the evening light softening the edges of the stones. "Your mother loved this spot. She used to say it had the best view of the sunset." He paused. "I'm not tearing it down." Sarah was silent for a moment. He knew she was weighing her concern for his well-being against her respect for his principles. "Okay. Dad," she finally said, her voice softer. "Okay. But be careful. These fights, they take a toll. Promise me you'll be careful." "I will," he said. But as he hung up the phone, he knew that caution was no longer the operative strategy. Ms. Vance had declared war, albeit a war of paper cuts and procedural poisons. And Arthur Pendleton, a man who had spent his life ensuring things were built to last on solid foundations, was going to prepare for it with the same meticulous precision. He pulled out the original closing documents for his house, a thick manila folder filled with deeds, titles, and surveys. He was looking for the foundation of his own claim. He spread the large, folded survey across his desk. The surveyor's seal was crisp, the lot lines drawn in thick, unambiguous ink. And there, at the edge of his property, near where the garden now sat, he saw something he'd never paid much attention to before: a faint, dotted line, with a small, almost illegible note next to it. "See easement deed, 734B92. He stared at it. A thread. He didn't know where it led, but he knew he had to pull it. 1 week later, the first official salvo arrived. It wasn't a phone call or an email. It came in a stark white envelope, delivered by a mail carrier who required a signature: certified mail. The intentionality of it was chilling. Arthur slit the envelope open with a letter opener, his movements deliberate. Inside, on heavy letterhead bearing the logo of Prestige Community Management, was the document he had been expecting. Notice of violation. It was no longer a friendly suggestion. The collaborative tone was gone, replaced by the cold, impersonal language of enforcement. The notice formally alleged a violation of the governing documents of the estates at Summit Ridge. It cited, as he knew it would, CC&R, Fargo 8.4.2, unapproved structures on lots adjacent to common areas. The unapproved structure was identified as a stone retaining wall and associated landscaping installation. The notice gave him 14 days to cure the violation. The cure, it specified, was the complete removal of the wall and a return of the area to its original, grassed condition. Failure to comply within the allotted time frame would result in the matter being brought before the Board of Directors for a formal hearing, which could result in the imposition of monetary penalties. It was exactly what Sarah had warned him about. The first turn of the bureaucratic screw. He felt a surge of anger, cold and sharp, but he suppressed it. Anger was a liability. Precision was an asset. He picked up the phone and called the number for Prestige Management listed on the notice. After navigating a robotic phone tree, he was connected to Kyle. Prestige Management. This is Kyle. How can I help you? The young man's voice was bright and eager. Kyle, this is Arthur Pendleton at 12 Summit View Court. I'm calling about a notice of violation I received today. The cheeriness in Kyle's voice evaporated. Oh, yes. Mr. Pendleton, I have your file right here. The sound of clicking keys followed, regarding the, landscape alteration. The memorial garden. Yes, Arthur corrected him gently. I'd like to schedule a time to discuss this with the Architectural Control Committee. The notice doesn't seem to provide a clear path for appeal, only for compliance. Well, the process is that you cure the violation, Kyle said, his voice now sounding like he was reading from a script. If you'd like, you can submit an ACC application after the fact, but it's unlikely to be approved, given that the structure already violates the view corridor standards. And who sets these standards? Kyle. Are they documented somewhere? I've reviewed the architectural guidelines and can't find any specific prohibitions on retaining walls of this size or material. There was a hesitant pause. The board. The board interprets the guidelines to maintain the community's aesthetic. Ms. Vance, as head of the ACC, has determined that the wall is not in harmony with the neighborhood plan. So the standard is Ms. Vance's opinion, Arthur stated, not as a question, but as a confirmation of fact. The ACC is empowered by the board to make these judgments. Kyle recited, the sound of institutional armor sliding into place, if you'd like to discuss it. There is an informal ACC meeting this Thursday evening at the clubhouse. You could attend during the homeowner comment period. Thank you, Kyle, Arthur said. I'll be there. He hung up, the feeling of cold clarity returning. This was a system designed to exhaust and intimidate. It relied on homeowners giving up, on their fear of fines and legal fees outweighing their desire to fight. It was designed for people who wouldn't read the binder. He would attend the meeting, but he would not go in expecting a reasonable discussion. He would go in to gather information, to observe his opponent on her own ground. He looked at the property survey on his desk, the faint dotted line, and the cryptic reference to an easement deed. His next call was not to a lawyer. It was to someone better suited for this kind of work. The ACC meeting was held in a small, soul-crushingly beige room in the community clubhouse. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glare on the particle board table. Carol Vance sat at the head of it, flanked by two other committee members who nodded along to her points with the unthinking rhythm of bobblehead dolls. Kyle was there, too, taking notes. Arthur waited patiently through a tedious discussion about approved mailbox paint colors and the unacceptable shade of beige the Hendersons had used on their trim. When the floor was opened for homeowner comments, he stood. Arthur Pendleton, 12 Summit View Court, he began, his voice calm and steady. I'm here to discuss the notice of violation regarding my wife's memorial garden. Ms. Vance gave him a placid smile. Arthur, thank you for coming. We appreciate your engagement. As we discussed, The wall represents an unapproved alteration that impacts the common area view. "I'd like to present my property survey," he said, unrolling the large document on the table. He used a pen to point. "As you can see, the official county-filed plat map clearly shows my property line extends to this iron pin. The wall in question is located here, a full 20 feet inside my property. The CC&R clause you cited, Paragraph 8.4.2, applies to lots adjacent to common areas, while my lot is adjacent. The structure itself is not. Furthermore, the rule is intended to prevent encroachment onto or visual blight of the common area. A low, moss rock wall is hardly a blight." He presented his case with the dispassionate logic of an engineer. Facts, measurements, a direct reading of the text. Ms. Vance did not even glance at the survey. "Arthur, we've been over this," she said, her voice laced with a patronizing patience, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "The documents grant the board, and by extension the ACC, the authority to interpret these rules. The view corridor is an established aesthetic standard. Your wall, regardless of its precise location relative to a pin in the ground, infringes upon that standard. The board's interpretation is that any structure that visually dominates the landscape from the common path falls under the purview of this rule." She folded her hands. "The interpretation of the board is final." The two other committee members nodded. Kyle scribbled furiously. It was then that Arthur knew for certain. Logic would not work here. Evidence was irrelevant. This was not about a rule or a view. It was an exercise in pure, unaccountable power. He looked at Carol Vance's face, the tight set of her jaw, the flicker of something triumphant in her eyes. This was personal. He calmly rolled up his survey. "Thank you for your time," he said, his voice betraying no emotion. He had the information he needed. He had seen the enemy's tactics. They were not fighting on the terrain of reason, but on the terrain of authority. And an authority that dismissed its own foundational documents was a fraudulent one. As he walked out of the clubhouse into the cool night air, his resolve hardened. If Ms. Vance was going to wield the HOA's governing documents as a weapon, he would have to learn to use them as both a shield and a sword. He needed help. He needed someone who knew how to navigate the labyrinth of public records, someone who knew where the bureaucratic bodies were buried. The next morning, Arthur drove to a small, dusty office over a bait and tackle shop on the outskirts of town. The sign on the door read, "Thorne Investigations and Records Retrieval." Inside, Marcus Thorne sat behind a desk piled high with chaotic stacks of files and maps. A retired county clerk who had turned his encyclopedic knowledge of municipal bureaucracy into a second career. He was a small, wiry man with a cynical squint and a palpable disdain for petty tyrants. Arthur laid out the situation, presenting the violation notice, his property survey, and his account of the ACC meeting. Marcus listened, peering at the documents through a pair of smudged reading glasses, making small grunts of acknowledgement. When Arthur finished, Marcus leaned back in his creaking chair. "Summit Ridge. Carol Vance. Yeah, I know the type. Thinks a 3-person board election makes her Queen of England. So, she's stonewalling you with the board's interpretation defense. Classic." "She refused to even look at my survey," Arthur said. "Of course she did. The facts get in the way of the narrative," Marcus said. He tapped a gnarled finger on the survey, right on the faint dotted line. "You said you noticed this easement deed, number 7-34B92. That's your thread right there. An easement is a legal interest in your property held by another party, in this case, the HOA. She's not just making up this view corridor nonsense out of thin air. She's basing it on this. But I'll bet you a box of donuts the easement is either vaguely worded or wasn't filed properly. "How can we find out?" Arthur asked. Marcus grinned, a flash of teeth in his weathered face. "That's the fun part. We go to the source, the county recorder's office. We'll pull the original plat maps for the entire subdivision, that specific easement deed. And, while we're at it, we'll make a formal records request to Prestige Management for every page of the HOA's meeting minutes for the last 10 years. Specifically, we want the minutes from the meeting where this easement was supposedly voted on and approved." "You think they'll just hand them over?" "They have to. State law. They can charge a copying fee, but they can't refuse a member's request to inspect the records. This is where they get sloppy. They count on no one ever asking." For the next 2 weeks, Arthur and Marcus began their counteroffensive. It was a slow, painstaking war fought in file rooms and on microfiche readers. Arthur felt a dormant part of his brain click back to life. The thrill of the investigation, of piecing together a puzzle from disparate, dusty parts. He and Marcus spent hours at the county clerk's office, poring over huge, crackling plat maps, the scent of old paper and binding glue thick in the air. They found the original subdivision plat map first. It was a thing of beauty to Arthur's engineering mind, a masterpiece of precision, and it was unequivocal. Lot 12, his lot, was clearly and cleanly delineated. There was no ambiguity. The land where the garden stood was his. Then, Marcus, with a triumphant grunt, located easement deed, your 734B92, filed 10 years ago. They read the dense, legalistic text. It was as Marcus had predicted, vague. It granted the HOA an easement for a scenic view corridor over a 5-foot-wide strip at the rear of the property line, for the purpose of preserving the natural and aesthetic character of the view from the common area walking path. It didn't grant the HOA the right to prohibit structures 20 feet away from that strip. More importantly, it was a unilateral deed, filed by the HOA, but with a questionable signature from the previous homeowner. "This is sloppy," Marcus muttered, squinting at the document. "But the real story will be in the minutes." A thick package arrived from Prestige Management a few days later, containing 5 years of HOA meeting minutes. Arthur sat at his dining room table, a fresh pot of coffee at his elbow, and began to read. It was a journey into the tedious soul of suburbia arguments over pet waste, approvals for swing sets, budget line items for pool chemicals. He cross-referenced the date of the easement filing, April 12th, 10 years ago. He found the minutes for the April board meeting. Carol Vance, he noted, had been the board secretary at the time. He read through the mundane business of the meeting, his anticipation growing. Then he reached the section titled New Business, and he saw it. A thick, black, rectangular box. An entire paragraph was redacted. The entry simply read, Item 8C, Discussion of Proposed Scenic View Easement for Lots, 10-14. Vote taken, redacted. Motion carries. Arthur stared at the black box. It was a void, a deliberate hole in the official record, a blatant, unapologetic act of concealment. Why redact the vote on a simple easement, unless the vote hadn't been simple, unless the motion hadn't actually carried? He felt a chill run down his spine. This was no longer just a dispute over a garden. This was a potential case of fraudulent conveyance, of falsifying corporate records. And Carol Vance, the board secretary who had signed and certified those minutes, was at the very center of it. The fight had just escalated dramatically. He now had the what. He still needed the why. Why go to all this trouble for a 5-foot strip of land? Marcus had an idea. Who was the developer's landscape architect for Summit Ridge? A few calls later, they had a name. Arthur found the original landscape plans for the common areas in the HOA archives. He unrolled them, and the final piece of the puzzle began to slide into place. The plans showed a proposed Phase 2 enhancement for the common walking path, including expensive new plantings, irrigation, and stonework. The enhancement project was slated for the area directly behind lots 10-14, the very area covered by the easement. The project had never been funded, but it was still on the books. If the HOA could establish control over that land, they could move forward. The final, damning piece came from a simple business search. The landscape contractor who held the standing, multi-year maintenance contract for Summit Ridge, and who was the sole source bidder for the proposed Phase 2 project, was a company called Vance Landscaping. It was owned and operated by Carol Vance's brother-in-law. The motive was, suddenly, starkly clear. This wasn't just about power or a grudge. It was about money, expanding the common area, even by a few feet, through fraudulent easements, would allow her to funnel HOA funds to her family's business under the guise of community improvements. His garden wasn't an eyesore. It was an obstacle. It was a private claim on land she had already mentally marked as public, profitable territory. Carol Vance felt him digging. She didn't know what he was looking for, but the formal records request had been a clear signal. He wasn't backing down. He wasn't intimidated. This quiet, stubborn engineer was becoming a problem, and problems needed to be dealt with swiftly and decisively. She called an emergency executive session of the board. The stated purpose, sent via email, was to discuss a sensitive homeowner compliance issue and potential litigation. This phrasing allowed them to meet in private, a convenient loophole in the state's open meeting statutes. The two other board members, long accustomed to following her lead, were in attendance via conference call. Kyle was there in person, his face pale. Arthur Pendleton has refused to cure the violation, Carol began, her voice crisp and authoritative. He has made it clear he intends to challenge the board's authority. This kind of defiance is a cancer. If we let one homeowner flout the rules, others will follow, and the integrity of the entire community will erode. She didn't mention the records request or the easement. She framed it as a simple matter of enforcement, of a rogue homeowner threatening their way of life. Therefore, she continued, I move that we find him in violation in absentia, as per the process outlined in the bylaws when a homeowner fails to cure. I also move that we levy the maximum initial fine of $500, plus all administrative and legal fees incurred by the association to date, which Prestige Management has calculated at an additional $750. The motions were seconded and passed unanimously, the disembodied voices on the speakerphone echoing their assent. The official hearing, which Arthur had never been formally invited to, was over in less than 5 minutes. 2 days later, another certified letter arrived at Arthur's house. This one was thicker. Inside was a formal notice that the board had found him in violation and imposed a fine of $1,250 due in 30 days. The letter went on to state, in cold, bolded type, that failure to remit payment in full will result in a notice of intent to lien being filed against your property. The threat was no longer procedural. It was existential. A lien was a legal claim against his home. If unpaid, the HOA could, in theory, foreclose. He was being backed into a corner. The financial and legal pressure ratcheted up to an almost unbearable degree. That evening, his neighbor from across the street, George Weaver, came over. George was in his 80s, a retired history teacher who had been one of the first residents of Summit Ridge. He'd seen boards come and go and carried the community's institutional memory. He held a plate of freshly baked cookies. "Saw the certified mail," George said, his eyes kind but shrewd. "Figured you could use these." Arthur invited him in. and they sat at the kitchen table. He explained the fine, the lien threat, the whole escalating nightmare. George listened, nodding slowly. "Carol Vance," he said, sighing. "She's one of the worst. A true believer in her own divine right to rule. She's trying to break you. Arthur, make an example of you." "I have evidence," Arthur said, his voice tight. "I have the plat maps, the easement, the redacted minutes. I can prove she's in the wrong. I can prove this is all based on a lie." "I believe you can," George said, taking a sip of the coffee Arthur had poured. "But you have to ask yourself a question. What's the goal? Is it to be right? Or is it to win? Because they aren't always the same thing." He leaned forward. "You can take this evidence to court. You'll spend $50,000 on lawyers. You might even win. 2 years from now, in the meantime, she will fine you every month. She'll charge the HOA's legal fees back to you. She'll put a lien on your house, clouding your title. She can make your life a living hell. And she'll do it with a smile, telling everyone she's just enforcing the rules." Arthur felt a wave of despair, the first he had allowed himself to feel. The system was designed to crush him, regardless of the facts. "So what do I do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Just pay it. Tear down my wife's garden." "It's what most people do," George said softly. "It's the path of least resistance. There's no shame in it. Sometimes you have to sacrifice a principle to protect your peace. Is this the hill you want to die on? Arthur, is this garden worth your home?" The question hung in the air, a terrible, pragmatic weight. Sarah had asked the same thing, for the first time. Arthur questioned his own resolve. Was his stubbornness a tribute to Eleanor, or was it a foolish pride that would cost him everything they had built together? He looked out at the garden, now shrouded in twilight. He felt adrift, the solid ground of facts and figures crumbling beneath him. The lien clock was ticking. He had to make a choice. The annual members' meeting for the estates at Summit Ridge was a ritual of manufactured community spirit. It was held in the large, multi-purpose room of the clubhouse, a space that smelled faintly of chlorine from the adjacent pool and stale coffee. Homeowners trickled in, collecting their proxy forms and paper ballots, settling into rows of uncomfortable folding chairs. At the front of the room, the board of directors sat at a long table, a united front of suburban authority. Carol Vance was in the center, radiant in a royal blue jacket, a confident smile fixed on her face. A large projector screen hung behind them. On it, a PowerPoint slide displayed the meeting agenda. The last item before the election results was Member Open Forum 30 minutes. Arthur had signed up for a 5-minute slot. He had made his choice. He would not die on this hill. He would dismantle it, stone by stone, in the public square. He wasn't going to court, not yet. He was taking his case to the true seat of power in an HOA, the assembled membership. As the meeting droned on through the treasurer's report and the grounds committee update, Arthur sat calmly in the back row, a simple leather portfolio on his lap. He felt no anger, no fear, only the cold, crystalline focus of an engineer about to present a stress analysis report. He had rehearsed this in his mind 100 times. He knew every beat, every word, every click of the remote that now sat in his pocket. "Finally," Ms. Vance announced, "we will now move to the open forum. Each speaker will have 5 minutes. Kyle will be keeping time." A digital countdown clock appeared on the projector screen, its red numerals glowing 500. "First up," Ms. Vance said, glancing at her list, "is Arthur Pendleton." A low murmur went through the room. Everyone knew about the garden, the violation, the escalating conflict. This was the main event. Arthur walked to the podium at the side of the room, his footsteps echoing slightly. He placed his portfolio down and connected his laptop to the projector. He looked out at the faces of his neighbors, then at the board, and finally, at Carol Vance. Her smile was gone, replaced by a look of wary condescension. "Good evening," Arthur began, his voice even and clear, amplified by the microphone. "My name is Arthur Pendleton, 12 Summit View Court. I am here tonight to discuss transparency, property rights, and the proper application of our governing documents." He clicked the remote. The agenda slide was replaced by his first exhibit. The countdown clock read 4:59. Exhibit A, CC&R, GR 8.4.2. The text of the rule filled the screen. 4:59:3:30. The board has cited this clause in a violation notice regarding my property, Arthur said. He used the laser pointer on his remote to highlight a key phrase. It states that ACC approval is required for structures on lots adjacent to a common area. It does not state that the board has the authority to regulate structures deep within the boundaries of a private lot. The purpose of the rule is to prevent encroachment onto common areas, a purpose I'm sure we all support. He let the words sink in. He wasn't arguing his case. He was teaching a class. He clicked again. The clock read 3:29. Exhibit B, Official County Plat Map, Subdivision 4B. A high-resolution scan of the notarized county map appeared on the screen. 3:29:2:0. This is the foundational legal document for our properties, he explained. He used the laser pointer to trace a thick, black line. This is the recorded property line for Lot 12. This is the common area. And this. He circled a spot far inside the line. Is the location of the garden wall in question? As you can see, it is not adjacent to, nor does it encroach upon, any common area. It is, unequivocally, on private property. A few homeowners were now leaning forward, murmuring to each other. Ms. Vance sat frozen, her knuckles white where she gripped the table. He clicked again, 2:00 on the clock. The tension in the room was palpable. 1:59:030. The board has justified its position by citing a view corridor easement. I have obtained a copy of that easement, as well as the board minutes from the meeting where it was approved. 10 years ago, Carol Vance was the board secretary at the time. He clicked. Two documents appeared side by side. Exhibit C, Meeting Minutes, April 12th. On the left was a document labeled Provided by Prestige Management. It showed the paragraph with the thick, black box of redaction. On the right was a document labeled Obtained via Official State Records Request. It was the same page, but without the black box. The text was fully visible. Item 8C, Discussion of Proposed Scenic View. Easement for Lots 1014. A lengthy discussion was held. Mr. Henderson, Lot 14, expressed strong opposition, citing concerns over property rights. A vote was taken. Ayes 2, Vance. Miller, nays 3, Henderson, Smith, Chen. Motion fails. The room erupted. A collective gasp, followed by a roar of angry questions. What is this? The motion failed. They lied. Arthur held up a hand for silence. The clock showed 0:31. He looked directly at Carol Vance. Her face was a mask of disbelief and fury. Ms. Vance, Arthur said, his voice cutting through the noise, calm and devastatingly precise. You were the secretary who recorded these minutes. The official record states the motion failed. The version in our HOA's files states it passed, with the vote illegally redacted. Could you please explain this clerical discrepancy to the members? cornered, a trapped look in her eyes. Carol stood up. This is an outrage, an attack on the integrity of this board. That is a forgery, and if there is a discrepancy, it was the fault of the property manager at the time, Mr. Abernathy. He handled the official filings. He must have made a mistake. It's a tragedy that he's not here to defend himself. She had deflected, blaming a man who had passed away 3 years ago. It was a cowardly, desperate move. And it was the moment of Arthur's secondary moral choice. In his portfolio, on his laptop, was one final exhibit he had not prepared a slide for: an email, obtained through Marcus's more informal channels. The subject line was re-easement vote. The sender was Carol Vance. The recipient was James Abernathy. The text was short, Jim. Just recorded as past. We'll sort the details later. This is for the good of the community. He could destroy her completely. He could read the email aloud, prove she was not only a fraud, but a liar who would slander a dead man to save herself. He saw the vindictive path open before him, the total annihilation of his enemy. He felt the temptation. Then he caught George Weaver's eye from the audience. The old man gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Be right, or win. George had asked. Arthur now understood. Winning wasn't about destruction. It was about building something better. The clock showed 0:05. Arthur looked at the panicked face of Carol Vance, and then back at his neighbors. He quietly closed his laptop. The records, he said, his voice resonating with a newfound moral authority, speak for themselves. The clock hit 0:00. His time was up. The room exploded into chaos. The carefully controlled decorum of the meeting shattered. Homeowners were on their feet, shouting questions, demanding answers. Kyle, the management agent from Prestige, looked like he was about to be physically ill. The other two board members were staring at Carol Vance with looks of horrified betrayal. A point of order, yelled a man from the third row. I move for an immediate, independent, third-party audit of this association's finances and all official records for the past 10 years. Second came a dozen voices at once. Ms. Vance, pale and trembling, banged her gavel. This meeting is adjourned, she cried. But her voice was lost in the tumult. No one was listening to her anymore. The power in the room had shifted, decisively and irreversibly. Arthur's 5-minute presentation had been the fulcrum on which a decade of unaccountable rule had been broken. He gathered his things and walked back to his seat, a quiet island in the storm of his own making. George Weaver reached over and squeezed his shoulder. Well done, son, he whispered. Well done. The following week was a whirlwind. The motion for the audit was overwhelmingly supported through a flurry of proxies and petitions, forcing the board to comply. The management contract with Prestige Community Management was suspended pending the outcome. And Carol Vance, facing a recall petition signed by over 80% of the membership, quietly submitted a one-sentence letter of resignation. Her reign was over. 2 days after her resignation, a letter arrived at Arthur's house. It was from the acting board president. It was a formal, written apology for the administrative errors that led to the violation notice. It confirmed that the fine of $1,250 had been voided and expunged from his record. The letter concluded by stating that the board now recognized the Eleanor Pendleton Memorial Garden as a valued and beautiful asset to the community. The audit, when its results were finally released 2 months later, was even more damning than Arthur could have imagined. It uncovered the direct financial motive behind the fraudulent easement. Carol Vance, through a complex series of shell corporations and pass-through payments, had been receiving substantial kickbacks from Vance Landscaping for inflated maintenance contracts. The proposed Phase 2 Common Area Enhancement Project was poised to be a multi-$100,000 windfall for her family. Paid for by the homeowners she was supposed to be serving. The matter was promptly turned over to the district attorney's office. At a special meeting called to reform the HOA's governance, Arthur Pendleton, the quiet engineer who had simply wanted to tend his wife's garden, found himself an unlikely and respected leader. He didn't run for the board. That wasn't his way. Instead, he proposed a new bylaw, which he had drafted with the precision of a structural blueprint. It was called the Transparency and Records Integrity Act. It mandated that all votes be recorded by name in the minutes, that all records be digitally archived and accessible to homeowners through a secure online portal, and that any redaction of official documents require a formal vote of the membership. It passed unanimously. The autumn sun, lower in the sky now, cast a long, warm glow across the cul-de-sac. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Arthur knelt on his foam pad, a bag of daffodil bulbs beside him. He dug a small hole in the rich, dark soil of the Eleanor Pendleton Memorial Garden, placing a bulb inside, pointed end up, a small promise of a spring to come. The low, moss rock wall had become something of a neighborhood landmark, a quiet symbol of principle. He worked peacefully, the silence broken only by the gentle scrape of his trowel and the rustle of the oak leaves above. He was no longer just tending a garden. He was inhabiting a hard-won peace, a sanctuary built not only of stone and soil, but of courage and conviction.